Hey everybody, how are you? My name is Victor Zarenin, and I've been trying to figure out a way to explain who I am and what this project is all about. And there's this one thought that keeps recurring to me. When I was in high school, I was reading this series of books by a British author named Terry Pratchett, and he wrote this one book whose title I could never get out of my head: Interesting Times. So the idea behind this book is that there's this old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. Now, it's not actually a Chinese curse, but it sounds clever, so people believe it. Anyway, the point is that it's nice to live in boring times when everything is peaceful and predictable and quiet. You don't want to live in interesting times. The French Revolution was interesting times. World War II was interesting times. Uh, People, we live in some pretty goddamn interesting times. It doesn't matter who you are or what political party you're in. Pretty much the only thing we can all agree on is that everything seems to be going completely and utterly nuts. And over the last few years, I've been trying to find out why. Now, for me at least, this story all started out with another Chinese curse: COVID. Now, before anyone freaks out, no, I'm not saying that the Chinese government had anything to do with creating COVID. So far, the majority of the evidence points to natural zoonotic transmission in the Wuhan market, though some agencies do believe that it might also have accidentally leaked from a lab. There is precisely zero evidence that it was purposefully bioengineered by the Chinese. Sorry for the interruption, but I have to say things like that because these days, the line between a bad joke and a conspiracy theory has gotten as smudged as Rudy Giuliani's hair dye. Google it if you don't get a reference. Anyway, my story starts way back in 2019. Right before COVID started, I found myself in Israel, doing this foreign students program called Masa. If you're Jewish, you can go over there, study a bit, and potentially stay in the country. Now, the specific program that I went in for was with Magen David Adom, which is the Israeli equivalent of the Red Cross. Basically, I was joining their version of an emergency medical service. We would be doing medical training for a few months, and then we'd start working with the more senior medics out in the field as we continued to get more training. And I still remember when we first heard about COVID, or at least when we first knew it was going to be a big deal, because the order came down that if there was even a suspicion that somebody had this new disease, we had to go in full hazmat gear. I'm talking the whole kit and caboodle, the giant alien head shield with the transparent plastic visor, breathing through an oxygen tank on your back, getting sprayed with disinfectant when you change in and out of the gear, and all of this. And that was going on, mind you, in the middle of the Israeli desert in the summer. So it sucked. I will say this though, the Israelis, they largely had their shit together. People more or less stuck together, more or less followed the rules. Basically, it could have been a lot worse. A lot of people worked really hard to make sure that it wasn't worse, including, in small part, me. So meanwhile, I was checking in with my family in the States, right? Of course, seeing how they were doing, making sure nobody was getting sick. And overall, we were very lucky. No deaths, nobody got particularly sick, not a single hospitalization. And a big part of that is because everyone in my family got vaccinated. And yet I was hearing things from my relatives, things about vaccines, things about the virus, things about George Soros and Bill Gates. I'm sure most of you get what I'm talking about. Moreover, it was coming from people in my family that I would not have expected it from. My relatives are Jewish Eastern European immigrants with advanced degrees, not exactly a demographic combination when you think vaccine skeptic. But who knows? I figured maybe I'd do some research and find something. Like I said, my relatives are educated people, so maybe they stumbled upon something that I'd missed. Admittedly, it would have been kind of hard to miss something because I was right on the front lines of this stuff as a first responder, but anything's possible and I'm a curious guy, so I figured I'd go looking into some of the articles and sources they'd sent me. What I found was a whole lot of nothing, really. Just pure conspiracist nonsense from a bunch of clowns who knew absolutely nothing about science or medicine, including some literal frauds. Like this one particular example, it came by a little bit later, but it was the kind of thing that I was dealing with all throughout COVID. It was a video from some guy named Peter McCullough that was supposedly heading a hearing at the European Parliament proving that the whole COVID thing was a scam. So as always, I immediately double check, and it turns out that there actually is such a thing as the European Parliament. So I went in and I looked at their website trying to find this guy in his hearing. No luck. There were some COVID-related hearings and events planned, but none of them mentioned this McCullough guy. So I tried to look him up personally, and I found someone who had actually tracked this guy down and investigated what he was doing. And it turns out to have all been a bunch of pure fiction. He was never involved in the EU Parliament, he just managed to get a room in the same building in order to video this fake conference. I've attached a link to the specific debunking here, and I've just got to give a shout out to this website, TechARP. It seems the website's main topics are around computer gaming and whatnot, but there's also a lot of incredibly useful fact-checking videos that deserve notice. So I've got a link in the description there, actually. Now, this McCullough fraudster, he was just one among many similar fraudsters that I was encountering all throughout COVID. both from my family and just random stuff I saw on the internet. Absolutely nonsensical stuff about testing and tracking and side effects. These articles were making claims that if you know anything at all about how vaccine development and testing is done, they're just silly. But my main problem with all this stuff wasn't just that it was blatantly factually wrong. There was this sort of paranoia around it all, like you can't know anything, everybody is lying. Where was this stuff coming from? And now I want to back up a little bit and provide some context. Back in 2019, 2020, I really didn't know a lot about politics. I thought I did because I knew a lot of history and some civics and whatnot, but I really didn't know anything about the daily grind, the who did what and what happened when type of stuff that you actually have to really pay attention to. Plus, I had the advantage of tuning most of it out while I was overseas. What I can say is that before I'd left the US, I'd considered myself a Republican, largely because everyone else in my family was Republican. You see, everyone in my family and all of their friends were people who had fled the Soviet Union as it was collapsing, mainly from Russia and Ukraine, both countries going through their own interesting times at the moment. And I'm sure that this will come as a surprise to a few of you, but living under a communist dictatorship sucked. And that's why we fled, and when my family got here in the early 90s, we weren't too far off from Reagan telling Gorbachev to tear down the wall. It didn't take long for that message to make all of my older relatives solidly loyal Republicans for 30 years. I was a nerdy kid at the time, and I knew a lot more about what was going on in Rome in 27 BC than I did about what was going on in America where I was actually living. My political identity wasn't really much more than a reflection of my strongly conservative relatives. And I'm sure a lot of you can see where this is going. Most of my family, they went for Trump hard. And not a little bit. Like, the MAGA hats and everything. I finally managed to basically avoid most of the drama surrounding Trump's presidency because I was overseas. I was blissfully unaware of all the insanity that was going on. But it all became very real to me when I heard Trump, the sitting president of the United States, telling people on TV to inject bleach. And I actually remember thinking so clearly at the time, Jesus Christ, this man is a moron. And I miss those times when I thought that he was just a moron. That list of adjectives has gotten a lot longer, but I'm going to leave it at that before anybody's ears start to bleed. When it came down to the conspiracy theories my relatives were getting involved in, everything led back to Trump. All the Trumpiest people in media were also the most anti-vax people in media, and all the most anti-vax people in media were also the Trumpiest. This was actually a surprise to me because I was more used to that anti-vax stuff coming from the flowery fringe of the left. All those people getting into homeopathy and crystal healing and whatever other nonsense. But now opposition to vaccines seem to be joining the same anti-science parts of the right that think that the world is 6,000 years old and that global warming is a hoax. It was infuriating to me. People were dying over this bullshit, paranoid, anti-vax nonsense. And not for nothing, but I'd actually worked pretty hard to save some of those people. It wasn't just statistics for me. Again, I got really, really lucky that no one around me died of COVID, but there were millions of people who did not get that lucky. And for a while, I was pretty narrowly focused on the COVID-related stuff. Every now and again, trying to have a talk with my relatives, send them some articles, etc. I honestly didn't put all that much effort into it because, frankly, I didn't think it would be that hard. I never really had a significant point of disagreement with my family on things like this. Now, we didn't agree on everything. Like, while I said I had identified as a Republican when younger, my actual ideology, if you could call it that, was more libertarian. I was very socially liberal, but my family didn't really care about any of that stuff before Trump. It was more low taxes and total paranoia about anything that sounded like communism, and I was okay with that, at least at the time. But COVID was the first time that we really strongly disagreed about something, especially points of basic fact, and it wouldn't be the last time. The more I started looking into Trump, the more disturbed I became. There was something just deeply wrong with that dude. I mean, he was so racist. I was stunned. It kind of reminded me of this one time a friend of mine, he was a movie buff, and he showed me some of those John Hughes high school movies from the 80s. And the only thing I can remember from that movie was that they banged a gong every time the Asian kid showed up. And I remember my mouth dropping open like, that is so racist. And Trump got me in the same way. I was just not prepared for that level of bigotry. And I grew up in a really diverse town. It just really seemed hard to imagine anyone thinking like that. I don't think I've ever seen anyone in my life be that racist outside of a documentary about the 60s. The things that Trump was saying were just mind-boggling to me. Worse than just him saying it, though, was what was happening to the people around me. I could see people getting more intolerant. Not just among my relatives, but more broadly in society. People who I knew really had never cared about any of this stuff were starting to get just obsessed with critical race theory and trans people in a way that had nothing to do with either their lives or actual reality. But whatever, it was a fluke, something weird and temporary. Politics always goes back to normal. And there was an election happening anyway, right? An election that was won legally, honestly, and fairly by our current president, Joseph Robinette Biden. And then 1/6 happened. It was sort of surreal. Even at that point, I hadn't started to really look into or follow what was going on in politics. So when it happened, it was so, I don't know, I really had no idea how to process it. It was just too big, too crazy. I mean, a goddamn coup attempt in the United States in the 21st century? Every time I think about what happened and what almost happened, I just get slammed with these waves of anger and disgust and just a little bit of disbelief. I had to stand in front of a mirror sometimes and just say to myself, like, yeah, that actually happened. It was right there on TV as everyone was watching. A mob of raving lunatics with their traitorous Confederate flags broke into our Capitol and took a shit on the Speaker's desk. And I thought, honestly, I don't really remember everything I thought. It was just so unbelievably insane. It was too big, right? I mean, that kind of thing doesn't happen. People can't just lie about an election right in front of everyone's face and then break into the Capitol. The instinct to kind of ignore it as an aberration, a freak accident, was really strong. But I couldn't do that. I saw what I saw, and while I hadn't been too up to date with modern politics at that point, like I said, I did know a good bit of history. And I knew in my gut that this was important, that this could lead to something really bad, something that was too dangerous to just ignore. Unfortunately, I was the only person I knew who thought that way. The first time I spoke to one of my relatives after 1/6, they were already telling me how the whole thing was a plot by the FBI and that all those people wearing MAGA hats and shouting for Trump were secretly members of Antifa. I found out later, after doing a truly ridiculous amount of research, that it took hours, if not less, for the first "it's a psyop, the feds, Antifa, gay communist atheists did it" conspiracy theories to start circulating. And then it just exploded across the media landscape and into the heads of everybody I knew. And everyone I knew believed those stories. Actually, they didn't just believe them, they believed desperately. They needed to believe that it was all fake, that 1/6 was anyone's responsibility except Trump's. I still remember talking to one of my relatives, who I considered to be not even particularly political, and when I very gently said that I believed that the balance of the evidence showed that Biden had won, and that his victory had been legitimate, this person, who is, let's not forget, my own blood relative, just started screaming at me, completely furious in a way that I hadn't seen in a long time. And it wasn't just one person. Everybody was so angry all the time. Slowly, though, I was able to at least get people to engage with me, to talk without screaming, at least for a few minutes at a time. I started looking into all those stories they were telling me about voter fraud and the FBI, and every single one of them was just nonsense, More than it was stupid nonsense, stuff that was so easily disproven, things that had absolutely no evidence behind them. Zero, nada, nothing. I'm talking stories that I eventually ended up tracking down to some random schmuck social media posting. Sometimes originally posted on websites I knew nobody in my family would even be on. And yet that same post was now everywhere, from Fox News to the mouths of members of Congress. And there was just so much. One conspiracy, two conspiracy, three conspiracy, more. I'd show someone a clear debunking of one BS story, no problem, they had 5 more. And then a week later, after some time had passed and they got back to watching Fox News, it was like we'd never even spoken. They just repeated the same nonsense I just disproved. For example, there was this one conversation I had with one of my relatives. I had mentioned the fact that some of the people who had broken into the Capitol on 1/6 were duly convicted in a court of law by a jury of their peers, and I get this reply. Maybe some of you have heard it, or some variation of it before. So, those trials are all rigged. How can you explain that all the concerned American patriots on 1/6 went to jail while not a single BLM rioter was arrested? Okay. There were plenty of differences between what happened around George Floyd's murder and the associated BLM protests that sprung up around the country in 2020, and what happened with the people who broke into our Capitol on 1/6. But a lack of prosecution was not one of them. Over 10,000 arrests were made for various crimes related to those protests, and many of those arrests did result in convictions. Now, what was actually happening at those protests, how they started, what they were about, and who went to jail for what is, shall we say, a very interesting story, which you can bet your ass was never covered on Fox News, but which I'll definitely do a video on later. The important thing to know for now is that there were plenty of people who had the hammer of the law come down on them for those protests, which anyone could find with a 2-minute Google search. I showed this information to my relative that very, very clearly the BLM rioters were not spared for selective prosecutions of the 1/6 rioters. Got some links to that in the description. And I believe my relative and I have had the same conversation at least 4 times. So far, it still hasn't stuck. I never really experienced something like this before. All my life, I'd valued rationality. Now, that doesn't mean I was always rational. As I get older, I realized that a lot of the things I thought about the world didn't entirely make sense and that I needed to update those ideas. But I'd always at least thought that rationality was important and that everybody would do their best to try to be rational. And that's what made it so hard, in part, to accept what was happening to the people around me. Somewhere in the back of my head, I thought that if I just did enough research and I had enough facts and detail, that they'd have to realize it eventually. I was wrong. There was always another story, another excuse, another conspiracy theory. It didn't matter that they were all paper thin, with literally nothing, no evidence at all behind any of them. It didn't matter that these stories contradicted each other, that somehow the 1/6 rioters were loyal patriots being kept as political prisoners, and also Antifa members and FBI agents in disguise all at the same time, and nothing mattered. Nothing. Everything was true and nothing was true at the same time. And I have to admit there were some pretty dark moments for me there. I really thought for a moment that I was losing my mind. I still think that the only thing that kept me sane through all of this was my lifelong love of science. Not just scientific facts or any particular theory, but the process itself. People think that science is biology or physics or chemistry, and it is that, but it's also something else. Science is a method to figure things out. And that method is based on a few core assumptions. One, that reality is a thing, that there actually is a truth, and there are wrong answers and right ones. Something either happened or it didn't. Two, that the way to figure out the truth, to tell reality from fiction, is with evidence. And that evidence can come in a lot of different forms, and often it takes some intelligence and creativity to put that evidence together in a way that makes sense. But at the end of the day, you should be able to test it all out and come to a conclusion. And that reality, that truth that I was talking about earlier, it doesn't care who or what you are. It's not personal and it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't pick favorites and it affects everyone. For example, Bernoulli's principle, right, that faster moving air has lower pressure than slower moving air, is one of the factors that helps keep airplanes aloft. It doesn't suddenly stop working over Chinese airspace. It doesn't become false if everyone aboard the plane is a Muslim, and it continues to hold true if the plane was designed by a black woman. And regardless of who you are, if you're a reasonable person, you have sufficient evidence of a certain thing, eventually you're going to reach a fairly similar conclusion. There might be some disagreement on the edges if there's just not enough evidence or information yet, but once that evidence comes in, even those differences get settled. Or at least that's how it's supposed to work. So why was everyone being so damn unreasonable? And where were all these stories coming from? They were everywhere, constantly new versions of the same handful of themes, that everyone was a liar, nobody and certainly no institutions could be trusted or relied upon, and that there were shady powers controlling everything behind our backs. Each one of these stories individually was easily swept away, but there were just so many and they were everywhere. It was kind of like the entire field of information was just getting deluged with some foul, stinky, rotten substance. And then I heard a guy named Steve Bannon talking about how he intended to flood the zone with shit. I got a link to that in the description. I do not like this man, Steve Bannon. I'd like to see him shot out of a cannon. He's the one who's arguably more responsible than anyone else in regards to helping create and spread Trump's lies. He was Trump's chief messaging guy for a while, especially early on in his political career, but his strategy of flooding the zone with shit, his words by the way, not mine, which means to put out such an overwhelming stream of lies that nobody can keep up, has become the #1 trick in the MAGA playbook to this day. I can't even tell you how often I think about that phrase and how it drives me insane. Flood the zone with shit. Who says that? Who thinks like that? How sick in the head does a guy have to be to devote his entire life to making sure nobody knows what the hell is going on? To just totally devalue any kind of truth like that. I mean, I've seen this guy do interviews. He's a sleazy little turd who thinks that destroying things built by people better than him gives his life some kind of value, makes him important. It kind of reminds me of the barbarians who sacked Rome in the 5th century. They probably thought they were important when they knocked over a statue that some guy had taken years to carve and watched them break in a second. And that's the kind of guy that Trump picked to run his messaging machine. Flood the zone with shit. Jesus. And the problem is this stuff works. Trump, Bannon, Tucker Carlson, all that crew, it might be hacks without the talent to actually make it fairly in the world, but they make up for it in utter shamelessness and a deep understanding of the worst parts of the human mind and how to manipulate it. It's stunning how effective this is. I'll give you an example. Just a few weeks ago, Senator Mike Lee was repeating a debunked conspiracy theory about the FBI causing the events of 1/6. His evidence was an image of one of the rioters holding what Lee said was an FBI badge, except it isn't. It just isn't. I'm going to post the link in the video description. You can literally see it in the photo that the guy is holding a big, bulky vape. It's one of those big ones that can fit in your whole hand. You can see the battery case, the nicotine chamber, the mouthpiece quite clearly. People can just look at it and see it right there in front of their eyes that this man, Mike Lee, is lying to them. But he does it anyway. And this works. Millions of people are repeating it and believing it, despite the fact that you can see the lie right in front of your face. And honestly, it wasn't surprising. The fact that people believe it, I mean. I've been researching why people fall for things like this, the psychology of it, and it's something I'm going to try to warn all of you about in some upcoming videos. What did surprise me, but shouldn't have, was the brazenness of it all. I mean, this guy is a senator of the United States, posting on one of his official social media accounts, putting out for all the world to see this picture that does not show what he says it shows. And the craziest thing is that Lee knows it's a lie. All of his Republican colleagues know it's a lie. And firstly, say what you will about Republicans, but as far as I know, their eyes do in fact work. There isn't a freaking LASIK caucus in Congress. Moreover, they have all the access to public records just like the rest of us do. And the public record includes the fact that the supposed FBI agent in the picture is actually a guy named Kevin Lyons, who is a Trump supporter, who was in fact jailed for breaking into the Capitol. And yet Senator Mike Lee, among others, just keeps saying that this guy was an FBI agent. He said that. He actually said that. He said that without any scintilla, without a scintilla of evidence. And you know what's the craziest part about all this? I'm going to repeat the last thing I said to describe Mike Lee. He said that. He actually said that. He said that without any scintilla, without a scintilla of evidence. Now, I'm sure most of you didn't notice because it fits so well with what I was saying, but I didn't come up with that couple of sentences. That is a quote. A direct quote, word for freaking word from who? Senator Mike Lee. That was Lee's understandably angry response from way back in 2016 when Trump accused Ted Cruz's father of being involved in killing JFK. Mike Lee knew that Trump was a ridiculous liar back in 2016, and now he's become just like him. And now I apologize for going off on a tangent there, but you guys have to understand how crazy this all is, how mind-bending the dishonesty is. Sometimes I feel like I kind of just have to say it all out loud to actually lay out the evidence step by step, just to reassure myself that it's the world that's gone nuts and not me. And I also don't mean to get this angry and riled up about it, it's just that these lies are hurting so many people. People I care about, people even that I don't care about, that I don't know, but someone cares about them, right? They have friends, kids, spouses, whatever, and all of them are being hurt by this, all of us. And that does matter. It matters to me if people are dying over nonsense. On top of that, it also does matter to me what happens to America. I know that there are going to be a lot of people who think that this sounds kind of silly, but I actually do believe in the American dream, or at least that it's something to aim for. Part of that probably has something to do with the fact that my parents are immigrants, but I really do think that this country is special, that we have an opportunity here to do something that's never been done before, to show the world that democracy can work for everybody, for all kinds of people. And I started this off with a line I liked from one British author, and I'm going to close out with another one. There's this guy, Neil Gaiman, who for my money is among the greatest authors to ever live. And he wrote this short story about America called Golden Boy, where the main character said this one line that really stuck with me. I want America to be the kind of place I thought it was as a kid. And that line really helped me, it really hit me, because I can remember being a kid thinking about this country. I have a very, very vivid recollection of most of my childhood, and I remember so clearly that I was just obsessed with being an American. It was just so cool. I mean, this country has a great story. It's the land of freedom and opportunity, the melting pot of all peoples and all cultures, the birthplace of modern democracy, the city on a hill. And now, of course, as I get older and I started learning things, I realized that it wasn't exactly that way, that there were so many things that need to be fixed if we were ever going to live up to that ideal, but that the ideal was at least something to aim for. I just never really thought that fixing that stuff had anything to do with me. I'm just some guy trying to figure out why I kept arguing with my relatives. But I really thought that for most of my life that nothing I said or did would ever really matter, that the forces of politics would just keep chugging along one way or the other. But in all my research, I realized that that was the biggest lie that we were all being fed. That our votes and our voices didn't matter, that nothing I could do would ever change anything, and that it didn't even matter or make sense to try because, as I said before, I'm just some guy. But then I look at a guy like Mike Lee, and I might just be some guy, but he's a frickin' schmuck. Just an absolute schmuck. And he's a senator. He's the kind of guy who has the power to affect millions of lives. If we don't try to do what we can to move our country in the right direction, guys like him will come in and they'll move it for us. But they'll move it in the way that benefits them and only them. And all of these people who we think control our lives, the politicians and the billionaires, they're not special. They're just people. And the more research I do, the more I realize that even the worst of them aren't our real enemy. The only power they have is the power we give them. The real enemy is within ourselves. It's the cynicism, the apathy, the hatred and distrust. That's really the main problem. All of the major policy debates of our time about healthcare, the economy, the climate, we can fix these problems. Many of the answers and solutions are already well understood and perfectly capable of being implemented. If we could just trust each other and care enough about one another's well-being to work together, we could solve all of these things. But the first step to doing that is to separate out the truth from the nonsense. And I think that people would choose to do the right thing if they just knew what that was, if they weren't being constantly lied to all the time. And jumping off that point, I want to make it very clear that despite my deep hatred for Donald Trump and everything he stands for, I absolutely don't hold a grudge against the vast majority of people who voted for him. Like I said, the guy bamboozled my entire family twice. And they're all good, honest, decent people who've been consciously and cynically manipulated by people with plenty of money, no scruples, and a deep understanding of the shadiest, most instinct and fear-driven parts of the human mind. If you voted for Trump, and maybe you're wondering what all those trials of his are about, or what's going on with the Biden laptop, or the crisis on the southern border, or trans kids playing sports, I think I'll be able to provide some clarification. Now, I'm not saying I have all the answers, far from it. I have been, however, repeatedly stunned by the depths of my own ignorance in the last couple of years. However, I am a pretty persistent nerd, and if I don't have all the answers, I'm pretty sure I at least have some. And for everything else, there's Google and time. Now, I understand that I absolutely can be wrong. I've been wrong plenty of times before, and I'm sure I will be again. But what I'm gonna do is try to be as transparent as possible. I'm going to list my sources and explain my thoughts to the best of my ability. If I do miss something, or if some of my analysis doesn't make sense, let me know. That's what we've got a comment section for, right? I don't want anyone to think that I'm trying to be a Walter Cronkite type person, telling people that's the way it is. Now, I'm certainly aiming to tell things as they are and as I see them, but I don't claim to be the final judge of what's right or wrong. I see this process as kind of a journey of discovery, a journey that we're all going on together. And I really don't care what party you affiliate yourself with, if any. Another thing that I've been realizing is that a lot of the Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, right-left nonsense doesn't really mean anything. These words have been screwed with so much that they're almost impossible to use. We all know that Hitler was far right and Stalin was far left, and yet they're essentially the same kind of horrible monster. That distinction was crap 80 years ago, and it's only gotten worse since. The way that I see it is that the only spectrum that matters is democracy or autocracy, equality or elitism, freedom or tyranny. You either think that all people are mostly decent and deserve to have their rights and freedoms respected and preserved equally, or you think that some people deserve to be treated better than others because they somehow are inherently better or more worthy or special. If you're in the second group, I've got nothing for you and you've got no place here. For everyone else, though, welcome. Just two final things. Firstly, while I don't exactly have a long-term plan as yet, my short-term plan involves making a few different types of videos. I'm going to be making longer explanatory videos about a whole variety of topics. The next one I'm thinking is to do one about voting in America, how it's done, how it's secured, and how politicians try to screw around with it. Now, that's going to fit into a handful of videos that also cover political violence and the events around 1/6. I figured there is really no more important issues than setting the record straight on that. And I'm also going to be making short commentary slash reaction slash thought videos when I think something is important and maybe needs to be explained or given context or debunked. Which will also be an excuse for me to vent about the stupid crap that happens every day that's more constructive than yelling at my cell phone screen. I may also, if time and spirit allow, try to make some funny videos. A lot of the things that are going on, while absolutely terrifying, are also ridiculously funny. Now, before I sign off, I just want to make a few acknowledgments. As I was saying earlier, it's pretty hard thinking that you can make any meaningful change on your own. That's why it's so important to know that we aren't actually alone. I originally got the idea to start taking the things I've learned and making them public from watching other people do it on YouTube. I specifically want to give a shout out to the Midas Mighty and the Midas Touch Network. I don't remember when exactly I discovered the channel, but I've been keeping up with almost every episode of every podcast. Listening to people like Politics Girl or Fred Wellman talking about what was going on helped me realize that other people were also struggling against this tide of nastiness that seems to have swept over everything in our politics. All the hosts on the Midas shows are just nice, normal people who seem like they really want to make the world a better place, and I like that. It wasn't just the shows, though, it was also the comments. One of the really rare places on YouTube, or anywhere on the internet, where people seem to be mostly people and not raging assholes behind a screen. Actual lucid conversation and even empathy. It was nice to know that there were so many other people that got it, that understood how serious the situation really is, and want to do something about it, or at least stay informed. But what especially gives me hope is that we've got so many people from all across the ideological spectrum, including people who formerly identified as Republicans, and some who still do identify as legitimate conservatives. I'm so grateful for the work of Ron Filipkowski, for example, who spends his days listening to what the members of his former party are saying when they think they're unobserved. You know, Steve Bannon's podcast, Mike Flynn's tour speeches, etc. I've watched some of this stuff myself, and in my experience, it's a lot like rubbing your eyes with steel wool. All that hatred and insanity pointed right at you. But somebody's got to be paying attention to what the bad guys are saying, right? And the fact that Ron stepped away from his former party to do this work, it's a real show of character. Even beyond that, though, I've got to specifically mention Jessica Denson and Michael Cohen. Please, I recommend to anyone with an interest, watch their podcasts. Both of them were fully entrapped by the Trump cult, and yet they were able to get out. And despite the fact that Trump and all of his cronies spent years and millions of dollars trying to destroy their lives, both of them are still here. They're still fighting the good fight and telling us what they saw while working for this guy. That's proof that people can leave, that it's possible to put this horror show behind you. And I just hope that we as a country can do the same. You know, the bigotry and authoritarianism can be put on the back foot, and empathy and openness can become the norm. I'd also quickly like to make mention of the NJ Universal Healthcare Coalition. I met with some of those people, and they're working very hard to try to give us here in NJ access to the same kind of healthcare that most of the civilized world already got decades ago. And they're good people, and they want to make the world a better place because they actually care about their fellow human beings. Link to that in the description. And that's the final theme I want to leave you all with. Empathy. I've talked a lot about how important science and rationality are to me, but the more research I've done, the more I realize that the solution to all of our problems is really something so simple, so obvious that I totally missed it. We need empathy in this country. We need kindness. We need understanding. All of our problems, all of them, can be traced back to people basically not giving a damn about each other. I hope that with my work I'll be able to spread not just accurate information, but also some understanding and goodwill for our fellow Americans. There's nothing we can't achieve if we work together, but to work together we have to care about each other. If you take away anything from this video, let it be this: treat people how you would like to be treated. That's it. See you all next time.